Clara Whitfield picked up her 2 bags, straightened her spine, and walked straight into 30 men laughing at her face. She didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She set her bags down in the dirt, looked at every single one of them, and said 4 words that would change that ranch forever. Watch me. If you've ever been told you were too much, too big, too plain, too ordinary to deserve a place at the table, this story's for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach hadn't even rolled to a full stop before the laughter started. Clara heard it through the wooden slats low at first, a snicker or two, then spreading the way fire spread through dry grass in August. By the time the door swung open and she gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the hard Wyoming dirt, it had become something uglier. Something that carried weight and intention. She had heard laughter like that before. She had heard it in schoolyards and church socials, and at her sister's wedding where the seamstress measured her twice and said nothing, but her silence said everything. She knew exactly what that sound meant. It meant they had already decided. She stood at the edge of the yard with 2 bags at her feet and 30 pairs of eyes on her, and she did what she had always done when people underestimated her. She took one slow breath. She squared her shoulders. And she refused to give a single one of them the satisfaction of watching her shrink. The Cole Ranch spread out before her in every direction: a main house, a long bunkhouse, a barn with a busted hinge on the left door, a corral with 6 horses watching the commotion with more dignity than the men beside them. The place was functional. That was the most generous word she could find for it. Functional the way an old boot is functional. It keeps the water out, barely, but nobody's going to mistake it for something worth admiring. She had traveled 940 miles to get here. 3 weeks on a rattling coach through Missouri, across Kansas, up through the raw northern territories where the wind came at you sideways and the cold didn't ask permission. She had eaten hardtack and dried beef and shared blankets with a widow from Ohio who snored like a man twice her size. She had read Nathan Cole's letters so many times that the creases had gone soft and the ink had started to blur at the corners. A quiet place, he had written. A decent home. I am a fair man, and I ask only for fairness in return. Those words had carried her 940 miles. She looked at the man standing apart from the others. Now Nathan Cole, she was certain of it, because he was the only one not laughing. He was tall, weathered in the way that men who work land get weathered, with deep-set eyes that were watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not cruelty, not warmth either, something caught halfway between the two, like a man who wasn't sure yet what he was supposed to feel. She had imagined this moment differently, but she had learned a long time ago that imagining and arriving were 2 entirely separate things. Miss Whitfield. His voice was lower than she expected. Careful, Mr. Cole. She nodded once, the way she had been taught, the way her mother had drilled into her when she was small enough to believe that good manners would protect her from the world's rougher edges. They had not, but she kept them anyway. A ranch hand to Nathan's left, young, lean, with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been made to feel small, stepped forward and looked her up and down with the slow deliberation of a man evaluating livestock at auction. She started, then stopped, then couldn't resist finishing. She's a big one, ain't she, boss? The yard erupted. Even the men who hadn't been laughing before found their way to it now, that easy avalanche of cruelty that happens when one person gives everyone else permission. Nathan said nothing. That was the part Clara would remember longest. Not the laughter, not the young man's face, Nathan's silence. The way he stood there and let it happen and looked somewhere just past her left shoulder, like if he stared long enough at the middle distance, the whole moment might resolve itself without requiring anything of him. She had seen that silence before, too. It was almost worse than the laughter. The young ranch hand, she would learn. Later his name was Colton Hayes, 23 years old, orphaned at 16. The kind of young man whose cruelty was really just armor he had never figured out how to remove, walked a half circle around her with his thumbs hooked in his belt. You know what we need around here, boss? We need somebody who can feed 30 men. 3 times a day, good food, hot food, every single day, no matter what. He paused for effect, playing to the crowd. You think she can handle that? He directed the last question at Nathan, but his eyes stayed on Clara. She answered before Nathan could. Can I cook for 30 men? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That was the trick she had mastered over 29 years of being looked at the way these men were looking at her. Now you let the steadiness come first, and you feel whatever you actually feel later, in private, when nobody is watching. Ask me again in a week, she said, and I will give you an answer with a full stomach. A beat of silence. Then Colton laughed. But it was a different laugh this time, shorter, uncertain, the laugh of someone who expected easy prey and found something else instead. Clara picked up her bags. Which way is the kitchen? Nobody moved. I asked which way is the kitchen, she said again. The same tone, no higher, no sharper. An older ranch hand, gray at the temples, a scar along his jaw that had the faded look of something earned, rather than acquired, pointed toward the main house without saying a word. She walked toward it. She did not look back. The kitchen was worse than she had expected. That was saying something, because she had walked into some sorry excuses for kitchens in her time. She had cooked in railroad camps where the only surface was a flat rock, and the only heat came from whatever wood the men could find before the work whistle blew. She had cooked in mining town mess halls where the previous cook had given up and walked out and left 3 days of burned pots stacked beside a broken flue. She knew what neglect looked like. This was neglect that had been going on a long time. The stove was cold and coated in grease that had gone gray with age. The pantry door hung crooked on its top hinge. 3 sacks of flour stood in the corner with the tops open, which meant they had weevils, which meant she would have to check every one of them before she used a cup. The one small window above the dry sink was filmed over with dust and grease smoke, and what light it let in was the thin, apologetic kind that doesn't actually illuminate anything. But there was a stove, there was a pantry, there were pots and pans, mismatched, dented, in need of scrubbing, but functional. The pump at the sink pulled water after 3 hard strokes. The flue opened when she knocked the rust loose with a cast iron spoon she found hanging on a nail. Clara set her bags down on the kitchen table. She opened the first one and pulled out her knives, wrapped in their cloth roll the way her mother had wrapped them and her grandmother had wrapped them before that. 3 knives, each one kept to an edge sharp enough to split a hair, because a dull knife is a lazy knife, and a lazy knife is a knife that lies to you about what you can and cannot make. She pulled out her recipe book, not a printed book, a handmade one, pages sewn together with thick thread. The cover stiffened with a piece of leather her father had cut from an old saddle the year before he died. Every recipe in it was written in her hand, and beside each one she had written notes in the margin. Double the salt in dry heat, halve the lard in summer. Soak the beans overnight if you have the time. If you don't have the time, soak them anyway. She had been teaching herself to cook since she was 8 years old. Not because anyone made her, because she had figured out early that people who fed other people were never entirely without power. She had carried that knowledge 940 miles, and she intended to use it. She was rolling up her sleeves and examining the state of the flour sacks when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. She didn't turn around. The pantry's a disaster, she said, and the stove needs a proper cleaning before I'll trust it with anything more complicated than boiling water. I'll need to take stock of what you actually have before I can tell you what tonight's supper will be. A pause. I beg your pardon? She turned then. Nathan Cole stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, looking like a man who had not been spoken to that way in quite some time. Maybe ever. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, and his expression had shifted from that unreadable caught halfway look into something closer to surprise. I was talking about the pantry, Clara said. I heard what you said. He stepped inside and looked at the bags open on his table, at the knives laid out in their cloth, at the recipe book propped against the flour tin. I came to ask if you needed anything. I need a complete inventory of what's in that pantry and in the cellar if you have one. And I need it before I can plan a menu. I need to know how many men eat at each sitting, and whether any of them have conditions that affect what they can eat: bad teeth, stomach trouble, that sort of thing. And I need someone to clean this flue properly, because I will not cook in a kitchen that could go up in smoke. Nathan stared at her. You want me to get you a list, he said slowly, like he was testing the words. I want you to tell me who on this ranch knows where everything is. I'll do the inventory myself. She paused, unless you'd rather, I guess. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile. But it wasn't the blankness from before either. I'll send Walt in, he said. He's been here since the start. He knows where everything is. Thank you. He nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped in the doorway with his back still to her and said, Miss Whitfield. Yes, I should have. He stopped again. Started over. What Colton said out there. And what the others. Mr. Cole. Her voice was even. I've been hearing things like that my whole life. If I spent time waiting for men to apologize for them, I'd never get anything cooked. She looked back at the stove. Send Walt in, please, he left. She stood alone in the disaster of that kitchen and let out one long, slow breath. Then she picked up the cast-iron spoon, walked to the stove, and started working on the flue. Walt turned out to be the older man with the gray temples and the scar along his jaw, the one who had pointed her toward the kitchen without commentary when every other man in the yard was still laughing. He was approximately 60 years old, spare in the way that men who have worked their whole lives tend to be spare. With hands like old wood and eyes that had seen enough to make them cautious about what they said, and equally cautious about what they didn't. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her work on the flue for a moment before he spoke. I'm Walt Greer, he said. Been with Mr. Cole going on 11 years. Clara Whitfield. She didn't stop working. Do you know what's in the cellar? Most of it. Come tell me. He did. It took the better part of an hour. Because Walt was the kind of man who, once he started talking about a subject he knew thoroughly, could not be rushed. He listed provisions with the methodical care of a man who had been the one responsible for stretching them through hard winters and bad supply months. Dried beans, several varieties, salt pork, smoked ham, one full one and one started. Cornmeal, 3 grades of flour, lard, molasses. Coffee, good coffee, he specified, because Mr. Cole didn't cut corners on the coffee. A rack of preserves, mostly put up by the woman who used to cook before she left. Dried fruit, 2 whole wheels of cheese wrapped in wax cloth. Potatoes that were starting to think about going soft. Clara listened and made notes in the margin of a blank page she tore from the back of her recipe book. What do they usually eat, she asked. Whatever they get, Walt said. That's not what I asked. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Beef, mostly beef. Beans, biscuits when somebody bothers. The last girl Mr. Cole brought in lasted 3 weeks. Before that, it was just the men taking turns, which he stopped. Which means nobody was eating properly, Clara said. Not for a good long while, she nodded. She looked at her notes. She looked at the clean stove, and the propped open pantry, and the 3 sacks of flour she had already sifted, finding weevils in 2 of them, and setting those aside for a separate assessment. Tonight I'll do stew, she said, with biscuits. Tomorrow morning is eggs and salt pork and cornmeal. By the end of the week I'll know enough about what you have and what you can get to put together something consistent. She looked up at him. What do they like? The men. What do they like, not what they eat? What do they like? He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that this was not a question that had been asked in this kitchen in a very long time. Colton likes anything sweet, he said finally. Can't make it through a day without something sweet if he can help it. There's a couple of the younger boys who'll eat anything you put in front of them. Doesn't matter. Old Jim Pierce has got bad teeth on the left side. Won't say so, but you can tell by the way he favors the right. He paused. Mr. Cole himself doesn't eat much. Not since he paused again differently this time. Not for a while. Clara wrote it all down. Thank you, Walt, she said. You can go. I'll have supper ready at 6. He was at the door when he turned back. "You ever cooked for this many before?" "I cooked for 216 men at a railroad camp outside Laramie for 8 months straight," she said. 30 is a quiet evening. Walt walked out without another word. But he was smiling. She heard it in his footsteps, the particular cadence of a man who was surprised and pleased to be surprised, and wasn't quite sure yet what to do with either feeling. Clara turned back to her stove. The afternoon burned down fast, the way summer afternoons in Wyoming tend to long and golden right up until they aren't. And then the light drops, and the temperature drops with it, and the wind comes in off the open land with the kind of authority that reminds you exactly where you are and how much of the world out here doesn't care about your comfort. She worked straight through. The stew took shape in the big cast-iron pot that she found wedged behind 2 smaller ones in the lower cabinet, the best pot in the kitchen, the one somebody had actually cared for before they stopped caring for anything. Its seasoning built up through years of proper use. She rendered the salt pork and built the base slow the way she had been taught, because a stew built slow gives the meat time to tell you what it wants to become. She added the beans that had soaked since she first identified them in the cellar, the ones that were still good, sorted from the ones that had gone past. She added dried onion and black pepper and a spoonful of molasses that she added late when nobody was watching, because the men who claimed they didn't like sweet things were always the first to ask. What made it different from any other stew they'd had? The biscuits she made in 4 batches because the oven could only hold so many at once, and she timed each batch to the minute because an overbaked biscuit is a personal insult to the flour that went into it. By 5:30 the kitchen was warm, with something it probably hadn't been warm with in years. At 10 minutes to 6, she heard the bunkhouse door and the sound of 30 men organizing themselves toward the main house. She smoothed her apron. She checked the stew one last time, adjusted the salt, put the lid back on. She lined the biscuit pans along the top of the stove to stay warm. She set the table with the plates stacked at the end, the way she had learned to do it in the railroad camp, where 30 men come through a door all at once will eat you out of plates before the last ones, through, even get to the front. The door opened. Colton Hayes came in first. He stopped when the smell hit him, that specific smell of a stew that has been built right, meat and beans and something underneath them, that takes a moment to identify, that low sweetness. That depth, and his whole face went through a series of expressions that he clearly didn't intend for anyone to see. He recovered quickly. He pulled out a chair and dropped into it with the exaggerated ease of someone performing indifference, and he said to the man next to him, just loud enough for Clara to hear, "Smells all right, I guess." "Probably tastes like nothing." Clara served him first. She ladled the stew into his bowl without a word, set the bowl in front of him, and moved to the next man. She heard the spoon hit the bowl. She heard the pause. She did not turn around. But she heard it when he picked up the spoon again, and she heard the silence that settled over the section of the table nearest to him as the men on either side of him processed whatever expression was on his face, and she kept moving, kept ladling, kept setting biscuits at intervals down the table's length, and she did not allow herself to smile. Not yet. Walt sat at the far end of the table. She reached him last. She ladled his stew with the same portion as everyone else, set a biscuit beside the bowl, and he looked up at her with those careful eyes and said quietly, "Smells like something my mother used to make." "That's the molasses," she said. "Don't tell Colton." Walt's eyes crinkled at the corners. She went back to the stove. She stood with her back to the room and listened to 30 men eat. Not the noise of it, not the surface noise of spoons and bowls and men talking across each other. The underneath of it, the quality of the silence between the sounds. The way conversation slows and then stops when something tastes better than expected, because the mouth gets busy with something more important than words. The room got quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of men who have nothing to say. The different quiet of men who are paying attention to something and don't want to interrupt it. She refilled the coffee pot. She checked the second batch of biscuits she'd held in the warming oven. She didn't turn around until she heard the first chair push back and the first boots hit the floor, and she expected to see the men filing out the way they would in any camp or mess hall, eat and go. No ceremony, no acknowledgement. Instead, she turned around to find Colton Hayes standing at the end of the table. He was holding his bowl. He was not looking at her the way he had looked at her in the yard. He wasn't looking at her the way he'd walked a half circle around her, like she was something at an auction. He was looking at her the way a young man looks at something he doesn't know how to process, not with shame, not yet. Because shame takes longer than one meal to build in a person who's been performing certainty their whole life, but with something quieter than contempt. Something uncertain. Is there more? He said. She took his bowl. She refilled it. She handed it back without a word. He went back to his seat. She turned back to the stove. And this time she let herself smile. Small and private, facing the warm iron of the stove in the kitchen that had been cold for years. In the place that had laughed at her 3 hours ago and was now asking for seconds. Nathan Cole was still in the doorway. She had felt him there for the last 20 minutes, had been aware of him the way you're aware of weather, when you're working outside not looking at it, but knowing it's there, knowing it has weight. He had a plate in his hands that one of the men had handed him from the stack, and he had not yet sat down, and he had not yet eaten, and she did not look at him directly, but she was aware of every adjustment he made to his position in that doorway. He came to the table eventually. He sat at the head of it, the way a man sits at the head of his own table, with a kind of careful authority that was not quite ease. He picked up his spoon. He ate. Clara kept her back to him. She had learned early that you do not watch people eat the food you have made for them. You let them have it. You let them have the privacy of their own experience with it. Because food, real food, the kind that's made with attention and intention, does something to people that they're not always prepared for. It touches something they have their guard up against. And if they feel watched in that moment, they will close off, and whatever the food was reaching toward will not reach. She heard his spoon go still. She heard the particular quiet that had settled around him specifically, different from the general quiet of the room. She did not turn around. She poured herself a cup of coffee, which she had earned. And she stood at the far counter, and she looked out the dust-filmed window into the dark Wyoming night, and she thought about 940 miles and 3 weeks on a rattling coach, and the letters with their soft, creased edges, and a man who had written, "I am a fair man, and I ask only for fairness in return," and had then stood in a yard and said nothing while his men laughed. She thought about fairness. She thought about what it costs and what it builds and who it protects. She heard the scrape of a chair at the head of the table. She heard his boots on the floor. She heard him stop behind her. Miss Whitfield, she turned. He was standing closer than she expected, not inappropriately so. Just closer than the careful distance he had maintained all day. And she could see in the lines around his eyes that he hadn't slept well in a long time. And that the tiredness had been there so long, it had settled into something permanent. He was holding his hat again, turning it by the brim. That same gesture from the doorway earlier. "I finished 2 plates," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I haven't," he stopped. Looked at the hat. Looked back at her. "I haven't eaten like that in a long time." She waited. He seemed like a man who had something to say and was taking the long way around to it, the way people do when what they're trying to say doesn't have a clean shape yet. "I want to apologize," he said finally, "for what happened in the yard. For what Colton said. For," he paused, "for my part in it." Clara looked at him steadily. "What was your part in it, Mr. Cole?" He met her eyes. He didn't look away, and she gave him credit for that. "I didn't stop it." "No," she said, "you didn't." The silence between them had weight but not hostility. It was the silence of 2 people who were being honest with each other, maybe for the first time, and finding it more complicated and more necessary than either of them had planned. "I won't let it happen again," he said. "I appreciate that." She turned back to the counter, picked up her coffee cup. "But I should tell you, Mr. Cole, I don't need your protection to do my job." I've been doing this job without anyone's protection for a long time." "I know," he said. And then quietly, "That doesn't mean you should have to." Clara looked at her coffee. She was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitfield." She listened to his footsteps across the kitchen floor, and the door opening and the door closing behind him. The kitchen was quiet. She put her coffee cup down and looked around at the stove she had cleaned, and the pots she had scrubbed, and the table the men had eaten at, and the space that had, in the course of one afternoon, gone from cold and abandoned to something that resembled a kitchen again. She picked up her dishcloth. She started cleaning up. Outside, she could hear the ranch settling into night, the horses shifting in the corral, the bunkhouse door opening and closing as the men went in, the particular sound of a place that has been worked hard all day and is now resting. The wind had come down from the north the way it does in Wyoming in summer, not cold yet, but carrying the promise of cold, that high, clean edge that makes you straighten up and breathe deeper. She had 940 miles behind her. She had a kitchen. She had 30 men who had finished their supper, and at least one of them, the loudest one, the one who had walked circles around her, like she was something for auction, had asked for seconds. She had a long way still to go. But she had learned something important in 29 years of being told. She was too much and not enough, at the same time too large and too ordinary and too stubborn and too everything except what people decided they wanted her to be. She had learned that beginnings don't have to be beautiful. They just have to begin. She hung up the dishcloth. She banked the stove for morning. She picked up her recipe book from the table and carried it to the small room off the kitchen that Walt had told her was hers, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. And she opened the book to tomorrow's page, and she started planning breakfast. She woke before the ranch did. That was habit more than discipline. 29 years of rising before the world asked her to, before anyone needed anything from her, because those first quiet minutes belonged only to herself, and she had learned not to give them away. She had the stove burning and the coffee on before the first light came through the east-facing window, and she was elbow-deep in cornmeal batter when she heard the first boots hit the bunkhouse steps. She had made a decision in the night, lying awake in the narrow room off the kitchen, with her recipe book open across her chest like armor. She was not going to wait for this ranch to accept her. She was going to make herself indispensable before any of them had the chance to form an opinion about what kind of woman she was or wasn't. She had done it in the railroad camps and the mining towns, and the one disastrous winter in Cheyenne, where the boarding house owner had taken one look at her and told her she was hired on a trial basis, meaning he intended to replace her the moment something better came along. She had outlasted that trial by 14 months. She had outlasted the man himself. He'd sold the boarding house to pay a gambling debt, and the new owners had asked her specifically to stay on. You outlast people by being necessary. You become necessary by paying attention. So she had paid attention all through supper the night before, cataloging everything Walt had told her and everything she had observed herself, the way old Jim Pierce chewed on the right side only, the way the youngest ranch hand, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, had eaten so fast he'd nearly choked and then looked mortified about it. The way Colton Hayes had asked for seconds, with his eyes fixed on the table rather than her face. The way Nathan Cole had eaten 2 plates, without once speaking to the men around him. A man who eats alone in a room full of people is carrying something. She noted that too. Breakfast went fast and loud and nothing like supper. 30 men before a workday are a different species entirely from 30 men coming off one. They came in separate groups, rather than all at once, the first wave while it was still gray outside, the second wave as the light turned gold, the third wave running because they'd overslept and knew it. They didn't sit down so much as land. They talked over each other constantly, about work and weather, and the price of beef, and something that had happened to one of the horses in the night that had 3 of them in a heated disagreement about whose fault it was. Clara moved through it like she'd been doing it her whole life. Because she had. She kept the eggs coming, 2 cast iron pans going at once, salt pork crisping in a third, the cornmeal staying warm at the back of the stove, coffee refilled before the cup was empty. She learned names by listening. The boy who'd nearly choked was Danny Marsh, 17 years old, and he thanked her so earnestly for his plate that two of the older men teased him about his manners until he turned red. The man with the beard who ate everything but the onions was Cal Briggs, and he pushed the onions to the edge of his plate with the resigned efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years and expected no accommodation. The one they called Roscoe said nothing to anyone the entire meal, but ate 3 full plates and left a quiet nod in her direction when he stood up to go, which she understood to be, in his particular language, a considerable compliment. Colton Hayes came in with the second wave. He sat down without looking at her, poured his own coffee, because the pot was right there, and he clearly felt that looking at her would cost something he wasn't willing to spend yet. He ate his eggs and his cornmeal without comment. He refilled his coffee. He was almost to the door when Clara said, without turning from the stove, "I put extra sugar in the cornmeal this morning." He stopped. She still didn't turn around. Most men don't like to admit they have a sweet tooth. The cornmeal is a good way to get it without having to own up to it. A pause that went on several seconds. "It was fine," Colton said finally. She heard the door. She turned then, just far enough to see the door swinging closed, and Walt sitting at the end of the table watching her over his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something that surprised him. "You poking the bear on purpose," he said. "I'm doing no such thing," Clara said, and went back to her pans. Walt sipped his coffee. All right. By mid-morning she had reorganized the pantry completely. This was not a small undertaking. The pantry had been arranged according to no discernible logic whatsoever. Things were shelved in the order they had arrived, rather than any order that made cooking from them remotely efficient, which meant that the items used daily were buried behind things used monthly, and the preserves from the previous cook were stacked in front of the flour. And the coffee was in 3 different places, because apparently whenever a new supply came in it had been put wherever there was space, rather than where the old supply was running low. She pulled everything out. She wiped the shelves. She sorted by category and then by frequency of use. She made a complete inventory list in the back of her essay book, item by quantity estimated, condition noted, items needing replacement flagged with a small mark in the margin. She was on her knees reaching for a bag of dried beans that had rolled to the very back of the bottom shelf when the kitchen door opened and Nathan Cole's boots appeared in her line of sight. "Miss Whitfield." "One moment," she said, and retrieved the bean bag, and sat up, and stood, and turned to face him with the bag in one hand and her inventory list in the other. He was looking at the pantry, or rather, at what she had done to the pantry, the systematic order of it, the labeled groupings, the way you could now see at a glance what you had and what you were running low on. His expression did that complicated thing again. "I need to ride into town tomorrow for supplies," Clara said, before he could say whatever he had come in to say. "I've made a list of what's needed. We're low on salt and running out of good flour. Those 2 sacks were weevilled. I set them aside. The coffee will last another week if the men don't drink it heavier than they did this morning. And they drank it very heavy this morning. I'd like to go early before the heat." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "I'll take you in myself." "That isn't necessary, Mr. Cole. If you can spare a wagon and someone who knows the road." "I'll take you in myself," he said again, not firmly, exactly. Just as if the matter were concluded. Walt can hold things together here for a morning. Clara looked at her list. She made a small notation. "Early," she said. Before 7, he agreed. He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the kitchen the way he had stood in the doorway the night before, like a man who had a reason to be there but had forgotten momentarily what it was, or had arrived with one intention and found something unexpected waiting. "You reorganized the whole pantry," he said. "It needed it. The previous cook never." He stopped. "Nobody's touched that pantry since he stopped again." Clara waited. "My wife organized it," he said finally. Carefully, like the words had edges. "Eleanor, she was very particular about the pantry." Clara looked at the shelves. She thought about what to say and chose the simplest true thing. It's a good system. I tried to keep to what made sense and not change things that were already working. Nathan looked at the shelves too. She would have appreciated that, he said. The silence between them this time was different from the night before. Less tense, less weighted with what hadn't been said yet. It was the quieter kind, the kind that two people settle into when they have each passed through a first hard conversation and survived it. "I'll be here before 7, he said, and left. It was Colton who picked the first real fight. Not that morning, and not over anything obvious. It came 3 days in, when Clara had settled into enough of a rhythm that the ranch had started to adjust around her without anyone admitting. That was what they were doing, the men wiping their boots more carefully before they came through the kitchen door. Danny Marsh appearing every afternoon to fill the wood box without being asked. Walt developing the habit of appearing at the kitchen counter around mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set beside her workspace without comment. She had ridden into town with Nathan on the second morning. That was its own complicated thing, 2 hours on a wagon seat in the early light, not quite silence and not quite conversation. The kind of tentative exchange that happens between two people who have shown each other one careful piece of themselves and are still deciding whether to show another. He told her about the ranch practical things at first, supply routes and the timing of the cattle drives, the water situation in summer, which was always the central problem in Wyoming territory, the names and histories of the 30 men who worked for him. Then less practical things, the way Eleanor had planted a kitchen garden in the first year and kept it going every summer until she couldn't. The way the ranch had slowly stopped feeling like home after she died and started feeling like a problem that required managing. Clara listened. She did not offer her own history in return, not yet, because she was still reading him, still measuring how much of herself she wanted to place in this particular man's keeping. She had misread men before. She had trusted practical kindness for something deeper and been wrong. She was not inclined to make that mistake again, but she did tell him about the railroad camp in Laramie. She told him about the foreman who had hired her because nobody else had applied and he was desperate, and who had told her on her first morning that he expected her to be gone by Friday, and who had cried, actually cried, the morning she left 8 months later, because a better opportunity had come up in Denver and she had taken it. Nathan had looked at her sideways when she told that part. He cried? He was not a man who showed emotion easily, Clara said. Which is probably why it looked so alarming when he did. Something about that sentence made Nathan smile, not the full version of a smile, not yet, but the shape of one, the architecture of it visible for just a moment before he arranged his face back into its habitual careful neutrality. She stored that away, the architecture of it. She could work with that. The supplies from town transformed what she could do with the kitchen, and what she could do with the kitchen transformed the mood of the entire ranch in ways that were small but cumulative. Better flour meant better biscuits. Better biscuits meant a table that men chose to linger at rather than escape from. Men who lingered at a table talked to each other, which meant that the sullen, clipped communication she had observed in that first supper, men eating in their own separate silences, even in a crowded room, began to loosen. By the end of the first week, supper was loud. It was Colton who noticed this first. And Colton who resented it. He came into the kitchen on the third afternoon, when Clara was alone, working through the prep for supper. And he stood in the middle of the room, with his arms crossed, and that expression of performed indifference he wore like a second hat, and he said, "You're changing things." Clara didn't look up from her work. "I'm cooking supper." "I mean on the ranch." He shifted his weight. "The men are different. They're looser, spending more time in the main house. Talking more. It wasn't like that before. Is that a problem?" "I don't know what it is." He uncrossed his arms, crossed them again. "Mr. Cole doesn't usually let people just come in," and he gestured vaguely at the reorganized pantry, the clean stove, the table that always had a pot of coffee on it now during working hours. "Change everything." Clara set down her knife. She turned to look at him directly. The way she had learned to look at young men who were picking fights because they didn't know how to ask questions. "What was it like before?" she said. He blinked. That wasn't the response he'd prepared for. "What, before? What was it like before I came?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she could see something move behind his eyes that the armor of his confidence didn't quite cover. "Cold," he said finally. Then, like he regretted saying it, "I mean the food was." "I don't mean the food, Colton." The use of his first name stopped him. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she waited while he decided what he was going to do with an honest answer to an honest question. "Mr. Cole hasn't been right since Eleanor died," he said finally. His voice had dropped out of its performing register entirely. "None of us have, I guess. She was the one who kept things." He stopped, looked at the floor. "She used to sit at that table," he said. "Right there. And she'd have coffee out for everyone, and she'd ask about what was happening, and she remembered everything, every last thing about every one of us." And he stopped again. Harder stop this time, the kind where the words run into something they can't get past. Clara picked up her knife. She went back to her work. "I'm not Eleanor," she said. "I'm not trying to be. I know that. But I am going to keep the coffee out," she said. "And I'm going to remember things, because that's how I cook." She paused. "You like sweet things. Jim Pierce chews on the right side. Danny Marsh eats too fast when he's nervous, which is most of the time. Walt takes his coffee black, but he'll drink it with sugar if you don't make a fuss about it." She glanced up. "That's not replacing Eleanor. That's just paying attention." Colton stood there. The armor didn't come all the way down. She hadn't expected it to. That would take longer, and she knew it. But there was a shift, a fractional degree of movement in his posture, and she recognized it because she had seen it in men in railroad camps and mining towns when they stopped performing toughness and started just being tired. "She used to put molasses in the cornmeal," he said quietly. Clara didn't look up. "I know," she said. She heard him sit down at the table. She heard him pour himself a cup of coffee. She kept working. They stayed like that for 20 minutes, him at the table, her at the counter, and nothing else was said, and nothing needed to be. The twist came at the end of the first week, and it came from a direction Clara had not anticipated. A man rode in on a Thursday afternoon while she was managing the supply delivery from the merchant in town. Nathan had arranged for weekly deliveries, which had been her suggestion and which he had implemented with a speed that told her he'd been waiting for someone to suggest it. She was checking the delivery against her list when she heard the horse in the yard, and then heard Nathan's voice change, that particular flattening of tone that a man uses when someone arrives who requires managing. She looked through the kitchen window without meaning to, or rather without meaning to make it obvious. The man on the horse was maybe 45, dressed too well for a working ranch visit, his saddle leather new and stamped with something decorative at the corners. He had the look of a man who had never moved through the world without being certain he was welcome in it, which was the most dangerous kind of confidence, because it rarely came from anything earned. His name, she heard Nathan say, was Harlan Voss. He owned the ranch 2 valleys over larger than Cole's, newer money but more of it, the kind of operation that was still expanding because the man running it hadn't found his edges yet. She went back to her list, but she listened. Voss was friendly in the loud, particular way of men who want something and are warming you up to the ask. He complimented the ranch. He complimented the horses. He asked about the last cattle drive with the specific interest of someone who already knew the answers and was testing whether Nathan did too. Then, after maybe 10 minutes of this, he said, "I hear you've got a cook who can work miracles." Clara's pencil stopped on her list. "Word travels," Voss continued, and she could hear the smile in it. "My man was in town Tuesday. Talked to the mercantile owner. Apparently your woman put in an order that had half the supply men in the territory taking notes on efficiency." A pause. "I'd like to meet her. She's working," Nathan said. "Flat. Of course she is. I just meant I've been having a hell of a time keeping a cook on my place. My crew's twice the size of yours. Clara Miss Whitfield's operation is." Her name, Nathan said, and his voice had gone very still. "Is Miss Whitfield?" A beat. "Of course," said, smooth, unruffled. "I'd just like to put a proposition to her, Cole. I pay well. Better than most. If she's as capable as people are saying." "She's not available. You haven't heard what I'm offering." "It doesn't matter what you're offering." Clara looked at her inventory list. She looked at the window. She looked back at her list. Then she folded the list, put it in her apron pocket, and walked out the kitchen door. Both men looked at her when she came into the yard. Voss smiled the smile of a man who had anticipated this and arranged his face to be charming. Nathan looked at her with something sharp and unreadable in his eyes, and she couldn't tell if it was relief or alarm. "Miss Whitfield," Voss said, turning his horse slightly to face her. "I've heard excellent things." "I'm sure you have," Clara said pleasantly. "What do you need from me, Mr. Voss?" "I'd like to offer you a position." "I have a position, a better one." He named a number. It was a significant number, nearly double what Nathan had agreed to pay her, and she was not a woman who pretended money didn't matter when money very much did. She looked at Voss. She looked at Nathan, who had gone completely still and was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, controlled on the surface. Something much less controlled just underneath. "That's a generous offer," she said. "I'm a generous man," Voss said. "And I have 60 men who need feeding." 60 men, she said. "That is a larger operation." "Considerably." She was quiet for a moment. Voss waited with the easy patience of someone accustomed to waiting people into agreement. Nathan said nothing. He had gone the particular still of a man who has decided he is not going to influence this decision and is finding that decision extremely difficult to hold to. "Mr. Voss," she said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Anything. Do your men know the names of each other's mothers?" A blink. "I beg your pardon? Do your 60 men know anything about each other, or do they just work together?" She kept her voice light, curious, the way she asked questions when she already knew the answer. "Because in my experience, a group of men who know nothing about each other eat like they're fueling a machine. They take in the minimum needed to keep moving and they leave. But men who actually know each other, who have a place that feels like something other than a job site, they eat differently. They eat like people." She tilted her head. "What do your men do, Mr. Voss?" He had lost the smooth edges of his smile just slightly. "They work hard and they eat plenty, I'm sure they do." She smiled at him, genuine enough to be polite, measured enough to be honest. "I'll tell you what. If I ever find myself needing a new position, you'll be the first person I come to." She took her list back out of her apron. "Now I have a delivery to verify. It was a pleasure meeting you." She went back inside. She did not hear what Nathan said to Voss after she walked away, because the kitchen door closed behind her and the delivery man was waiting with 3 crates stacked by the door. But she heard the horse leave, and then, a few minutes later, she heard Nathan's boots on the kitchen steps. He came in. He stood in the kitchen. He said nothing for several seconds. "The delivery looks right," Clara said, without turning from the crates. "Except they sent the wrong grade of cornmeal again." "I've made a note." "You turned him down," Nathan said. "I noted the wrong cornmeal." "Miss Whitfield," she turned. He was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands again, that same hat, always turning by the brim, and he was looking at her with an expression that had given up on being controlled. Something had come through it, not desperation exactly, but the territory adjacent to it. The territory of a man who has been protecting himself for so long that when something he cares about is nearly taken, he doesn't have the armor in the right places. "Why?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 940 miles and letters with soft creased edges and a man who had not stopped what happened in his own yard. She thought about Colton at the kitchen table, saying cold, with the armor cracked just enough to let the word out. She thought about Walt's eyes crinkling at the corners. She thought about 30 men eating in a silence that had warmth in it, instead of just nothing. "Because I'm not finished here," she said. And then, because it was true and she had decided she wasn't going to protect herself by pretending otherwise. And because this is the first place I've been in a very long time where I think something worth finishing is actually possible. Nathan looked at her. He turned his hat one more time by the brim. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He stayed for supper that night. Not in the doorway at the table, at the head of it, the way she had watched him sit the first night, but with something different in how he occupied the space. Less like management. More like a man who had decided to be somewhere rather than just be present at it. The men noticed. She noticed them noticing. Colton, sitting midway down the table, looked between Nathan and Clara twice, with the particular expression of someone recalculating something they thought they already had figured out. Danny Marsh, who noticed very little of adult social complexity, was absorbed entirely in his third biscuit. Walt, at the end of the table, watched everything with those careful weathered eyes and said nothing, and drank his coffee with 2 sugars, because she had started just putting them in. The supper that night was beef and onion pie, with a lard crust that she had spent the better part of the afternoon constructing, because pie crust was an act of patience, and she had been in the mood for patience after Voss left. It was the kind of food that takes time, and everyone who eats it knows it took time. And there is a specific kind of trust embedded in food that took time, the cook's trust, that the eaters were worth the effort. The room was quiet the way it had been that first night, but the quality of the quiet was completely different now. That first night it had been surprise. This was something closer to belonging. It was Danny Marsh who broke the silence, the way it was often the youngest and least self-conscious person in a room who names the thing everyone else is busy not naming. He looked up from his plate and said, "To no one in particular and everyone at once, this is the best thing I've ever eaten in my whole life." Several men laughed, not cruelly the easy laugh of people who feel good enough to find things funny. Colton said, to his plate, not quite quietly enough, "Don't tell her that. She'll charge extra." More laughter. Clara, standing at the stove, kept her back to all of them. But she pressed her lips together and looked at the wall above the stove and breathed in through her nose, because she would not, she had decided, cry in this kitchen over anything as simple as belonging. She would not. She almost did anyway. The cattle drive came back 4 days early, and it came back wrong. Clara heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of horses pushed past their comfortable pace, hooves hitting the yard in a rhythm that had urgency in it, and then voices, multiple voices, talking over each other in the compressed shorthand of men who have been through something together and haven't yet decompressed enough to explain it to anyone who wasn't there. She was halfway through the morning bread when Nathan came through the kitchen door at a speed that was not quite running but was everything just short of it. "The drive's back," he said. She had already turned from the stove. "How many?" "All 30 hurt." He stopped. Caught his breath. Blizzard came down from the north 2 nights ago. Unseasonable, nobody predicted it. They got the herd sheltered, but they've been riding through cold and wet for 36 hours straight. He looked at the stove. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. They're going to be in a bad way. How long until they're in the yard? 20 minutes. Maybe less. Clara was already moving. She had cooked through emergencies before the railroad camp flood of '71, when she had fed 200 men on cold provisions for 3 days because the fire situation was too dangerous for a lit stove. The mining town winter bear when half the crew came in with frostbite, and she had learned that a man with frozen hands cannot hold a cup without help, and plans accordingly. She did not panic in emergencies. Panic was a luxury that the person responsible for feeding everyone could not afford. "Get Walt," she said. "Tell him I need the cellar opened, and I need someone carrying up the salt pork and whatever smoked meat we have left. Tell Danny to fill every pot we have with water and get them on the stove. Tell whoever is closest to start a second fire in the yard I'm going to need more heat than this kitchen alone can give me." Nathan stared at her for half a second. "Go," she said. He went. What followed was 30 minutes that Clara would not remember in sequence, because emergency cooking exists outside of ordinary time. She moved by training and instinct and the accumulated muscle memory of years, And things got done not because she thought them through, but because her hands knew what to do, before her mind had finished forming the instruction. The big cast-iron pot, her pot, the one she had claimed on the first day, went on the front burner with water and salt pork and every dried onion left in the pantry. A second pot, borrowed from the bunkhouse kitchen that she had never used, went beside it. She stretched the stew with more water than she normally would have, and compensated with more salt and the last of the molasses and dried beans that had been soaking since the day before because she had developed the habit of always having something soaking. The bread she had been making, she pulled from its proofing and shaped into smaller rolls that would bake faster. The biscuit dough she had mixed the night before and left covered in the cold, a habit she had developed for exactly this kind of situation. Because a cook who plans for nothing going right will always have something to offer when nothing goes right, she cut and laid on every pan she owned. Danny Marsh appeared at the kitchen door, looking like he had run. Mr. Cole said you need water on the stove, every pot full. Now. He was gone and back in under 2 minutes, moving with the frantic energy of a 17-year-old who had been given a clear directive, and found that clarity enormously relieving. He filled pots. He didn't ask questions. She made a mental note that Danny Marsh, under pressure, was worth 3 men who thought too much. Walt appeared next, carrying salt pork under each arm, and the expression of a man who had seen enough to know that this woman did not need instruction, she needed support. What else, he said. The cheese in the cellar, both wheels. And the preserves, all of them. I don't care what kind. And if there's anything else down there that I haven't cataloged yet, now is the time to tell me. Walt said there's a crock of rendered lard that Eleanor put up, must be 2 years old. I don't know if it's still good. Bring it up. I'll check it. He went. She heard the yard before she saw it, that specific configuration of sounds that means a large group of exhausted men arriving somewhere they consider safe. Horses' voices, the particular low groan that a man allows himself only when he believes nobody important is listening. Then boots on the main house steps, and the door, and 30 men filling the dining room in various states of wet and cold, and the specific hollowed-out look that comes from too many hours of hard riding with not enough food and sleep. She heard Nathan's voice cutting through the noise, organizing, directing, take that corner, sit down, don't pile up at the door and under it. The undertone of relief in 30 different registers that sounds, collectively, like a roomful of men exhaling. She kept cooking. The first bowls went out before the stew was fully done, because a man who has been cold and hungry for 36 hours does not need perfect, he needs hot and substantial. And she had both. Walt carried bowls, Danny carried bread. She stayed at the stove because the stove was where everything originated, and she could not afford to leave it. She heard the room change. She had learned to read rooms by sound, the way the quality of noise shifts when food arrives, the way 30 separate miserable men become something slightly more collective when they are eating together. The complaints that had been coming through the wall since the first men sat down, who was responsible for the route decision, whose call it was to push through the second night. The horse that had nearly gone lame on the North Ridge, those complaints softened. Not stopped, but softened the way arguments do when the people having them have been fed and are no longer operating on empty. Colton Hayes came into the kitchen. He was wet through to the skin, his hat so soaked it had lost its shape, and he was carrying 4 empty bowls stacked in his arms, which told her the nearest men had finished, and asked him to bring them back, because that was faster than waiting. He set the bowls on the counter. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at the stove going full, the pot, the bread lined up in the warming oven. The organized chaos of a kitchen producing food for 30 at speed, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. It was not the performed indifference. It was not the calculating look he'd had the first day in the yard. It was something younger and less defended, the expression of someone who has come in from the cold, literally and otherwise, and found something warm waiting that they had not expected and do not entirely know how to receive. How did you, he started. How did I what? How did you know we were coming? This is. He looked at the pots again. You can't have started this after we rode in. I started it when Mr. Cole told me you were 20 minutes out. That's not enough time. It is if you plan ahead. She ladled more stew into the 4 bowls. The bread I started this morning. The beans have been soaking since yesterday. The biscuit dough was made last night. She handed him the bowls. Take those before they cool. He took them. He was at the door when he stopped. He stood there with his back to her, and 4 bowls of hot stew in his arms, and the wet from the ride still coming off his jacket. And she could see the tension in his shoulders, the specific tension of someone preparing to say something that cost them something. Thank you, he said. It was quiet enough that she might have missed it. She didn't miss it. Go eat, she said, before it gets cold. He went. She turned back to the stove and she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do in this kitchen, which was press the back of her hand against her mouth and breathe very carefully until the feeling passed. It passed. She turned back to the pots. The twist came 2 hours later, when the men had eaten and the room had moved from emergency to aftermath, that particular post-crisis quality of a group of people who have survived something together and are now sorting out how to feel about it. Some of the men had fallen asleep in their chairs. Danny Marsh had gone fully horizontal on one of the benches, hat over his face, snoring. Walt was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, quiet and watchful. Nathan Cole came into the kitchen alone. He sat down across from Walt and didn't speak for a moment. He had eaten, she had made sure of that. Had personally put a bowl in front of him 2 hours ago, when she noticed he was still moving through the room managing his men, and hadn't sat down, but he looked like a man carrying something that food hadn't touched. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He looked up. Harlan Voss, he said, was at the North Ridge. The kitchen went very still. Walt looked up from his cup. Clara turned slowly from the stove. He wasn't there by accident, Nathan continued. His voice was even controlled, the voice of a man who has had 2 hours to get his anger under a functional level of management. His men were at the ridge 2 days before the storm. My foremen saw their camp Voss's brand on the horses Voss's men. They'd driven 200 head of my cattle northwest, away from the route into the path of the storm. Clara understood before he finished the sentence. They stampeded your herd deliberately. They tried to. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. My men held it. Lost 30 head 30 I know of, but they held the rest. He was quiet. If the drive had gone the way Voss wanted it to, I'd have come home with a fraction of what I left with. Maybe enough to cover debts for the season, maybe not. He was trying to break you, Walt said, low and flat. He's been trying for 2 years. Nathan's jaw set. Every time I've had a solid season, something has gone wrong on the back end. Supply prices suddenly higher than I was quoted. Water rights disputes that came from nowhere. Small things I couldn't prove were connected. Clara looked at her coffee pot. She looked at the window. She thought about Harlan Voss riding into this yard, charming and well-dressed, naming a number that was more than double what Nathan paid her. He came here to hire me away, she said. Both men looked at her. He came here the week I arrived. Offered me a significant sum. She paused. I thought he was just an opportunistic man who wanted a good cook. She set the coffee pot down. But he came right after word got out that things here were improving. He came after the mercantile supply order, after people in town started noticing. She looked at Nathan. If he'd gotten me away from here, what would that have done to this ranch? Nathan was very still, morale, Walt said quietly. If she'd gone with Voss right after coming in, after things had started to change, the men would have taken it as a sign. They'd have figured there was no point in the place improving. It would have demoralized the crew, Nathan said. His voice had gone tight, right before the drive. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. He's not just trying to break you financially, Clara said. He's trying to break the people who work for you. Nathan looked at her. The controlled anger expression had shifted into something more complicated, more alive. You knew something was off when he was here. I knew he was too interested in something that shouldn't have concerned him, she said. A man who owns a ranch twice this size doesn't ride over personally to hire a cook. He sends someone. But you didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say yet. She sat down at the table. I do now. She laid out what she knew, which was less than she suspected, and she was careful to keep those two things separate. Voss's ranch was expanding in a direction that made Cole's water rights valuable. She had heard this from the mercantile owner when she was in town. The kind of information that flows freely through commercial conversation, because nobody thinks a woman buying flour is paying attention to land politics. Voss's operation ran on credit more than people realized, also from the mercantile. Different conversation, same principle. A man operating on credit who needs water rights and is worried about competition does not send polite offers. He sends problems. Nathan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been piecing this together?" "Since the morning after Voss's visit." She looked at him. "I should have said something sooner. I wasn't sure enough." "You're sure now?" "I'm sure enough." She paused. "The question is what you do about it." A long silence. Walt drained his coffee cup, set it down, and said, "With the economy of a man who had earned the right to simple declarative statements, you go to the land office. You get everything on record. You make sure every water right and every boundary is documented so tight that there is no gap for him to work into." "I've done that," Nathan said. "Do it again," Walt said. "Do it with a lawyer this time." Clara said, "Is there anyone in town who knew Eleanor? Anyone she was close to? Who's been here long enough to know the history of this property?" Nathan looked at her sideways. "Why? Because a man like Voss works by making things murky," she said. "History makes things clear. If there are people who remember who built what and when and how, that's harder to dispute than paper." She paused. "Papers can be forged. Witnesses are more complicated." The silence that followed had a different texture, not the silence of three people with nothing to say, but the silence of three people thinking at the same time, which is a much more productive kind. "Margaret Hale," Nathan said finally. "She and Eleanor were close. She's been in this valley since before anyone else. She knows everything." He paused. "She doesn't like me much." "Why not?" Clara asked. He looked slightly uncomfortable. "She thought Eleanor deserved better." "Did she?" An even longer pause. "Probably," he said. "I worked a lot. I wasn't always present." Clara looked at her hands on the table. "Would she talk to me?" Nathan blinked. "To you, I'm not you," she said simply. "That might help." Walt made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. Before Nathan could answer, the kitchen door opened, and Colton Hayes came in with the particular energy of a man who had been listening just outside, long enough to know the shape of the conversation without hearing the specifics. "Voss's men are back at the North Ridge," he said. No preamble. Roscoe spotted them on his way to check the livestock. 3 of them, just sitting. Nathan stood up. "They're not doing anything," Colton said quickly. "Just sitting." "Watching what?" Clara said. Colton looked at her. Then he said something she had not expected from him. Something that landed with the weight of a man who had crossed some internal threshold and was operating from a different position than the one he'd held when he walked circles around her in the yard that first day. "Watching to see if we're rattled," he said. "That's what Voss does. He pushes, and then he watches to see if you flinch. If you flinch, he pushes again. If you paused. If you don't, he has to decide if you're worth the trouble." The room looked at Colton. Colton looked at the floor. "I grew up 2 counties from Voss's original spread," he said. "Before he sold it. Before he moved here." A pause. "I watched him do it to 3 families. He said it the way people say things they have been carrying too long without drama, just the flat exhausted weight of it. He moves in, he watches. He waits for someone to need money, or make a mistake, or get tired. And then he offers to help." He looked up at Nathan. "The help always costs more than the problem." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was 16 when I watched him do it," Colton said. And because he stopped, started again, because one of the families he did it to was mine. The sentence fell into the room and nobody moved for a moment. Clara looked at Colton Hayes, 23 years old, orphaned at 16, the particular cruelty that is really armor. The armor that turns out to be protecting something genuinely broken underneath, and she understood something about him that reordered everything she had observed in the 3 weeks since she arrived. Nathan crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and put his hand on Colton's shoulder. Colton didn't move away. That was everything, the not moving away. The allowing of it. Tell me, Nathan said, quiet. Absolute. And Colton told him. It took 20 minutes and 3 cups of coffee, and at one point Clara quietly left the table to refill the bread pan because something that needed to be said needed room. And she had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a person can do in some moments is make sure there is enough warmth and enough to eat, and then step back and let the moment be what it needs to be. By the time Colton finished, the shape of what Voss had done to his family, a water rights dispute that became a debt that became a foreclosure when Colton's father was already sick, completed in the year after Colton's mother died, executed with the clean, terrible efficiency of a man who knew exactly when a person was too tired to fight back, was laid out in the kitchen like a map of damage that had been hidden under anger for 7 years. Nathan looked at Colton for a long moment. You should have told me, he said. I know, Colton said. I'm telling you now, Nathan said, that whatever Voss did to your family, I intend to make sure he does not do to this ranch. And I intend to make sure he answers for what he did before. He looked at Walt. He looked at Clara. All of us together. That's how we do this. Clara looked around the kitchen at Nathan, at Walt, at Colton with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and the armor genuinely off for the first time since she had met him, and she thought about what she had said to Voss in this yard. About men who know each other eating differently from men who don't. She thought about what she had known even then, standing in that yard, that she couldn't have articulated yet. It was this exact thing. A table that people gathered around not because they had to, but because something at it was worth coming back for. And when you had that, when you had built that, the people at that table would fight for it. Not because they were told to, because it was theirs. I'll go see Margaret Hale in the morning, she said. Everyone looked at her. She knew Eleanor. She knows the history of this property. And she doesn't like Nathan. She looked at Nathan. That makes her the most credible witness Voss won't be able to argue with, because she has no obvious reason to defend you. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. You can't go alone. I'll take Walt. Walt nodded once, without being asked. As if it were already decided, and he had simply been waiting for the conversation to catch up. And Clara continued, I want to look at every document you have for this property. Every deed, every water rights agreement, every letter from the land office. Tonight, if you have them. Tonight. Voss's men are sitting on the North Ridge, watching to see if we flinch, she said. The answer to that is not to flinch. The answer is to be 3 steps ahead of him before he decides what to do next. She looked around the table. So, the documents, where are they? Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that had not been there on the day she arrived. Not just respect. She had earned pieces of that already, but something more like recognition. The particular look of a man who has been trying to carry something alone for a very long time, and has just realized, with a combination of relief and disorientation, that he doesn't have to. The study, he said, top drawer of the desk. Clara stood up. She picked up her coffee cup, rinsed it at the sink, set it to dry. I'll start with the oldest ones. Those tend to be the ones people don't think to challenge until it's too late. She walked out of the kitchen toward the study. Behind her, she heard Walt say, very quietly, to no one in particular, 30 men rode into a blizzard and came back. That woman hasn't gone anywhere. You do the math. She kept walking. But she was already thinking about what she would find in those documents, and what Margaret Hale might know, and what a man like Harlan Voss looked like when his careful plan started coming apart at the edges. and how important it was in that moment to be ready. The documents were older than she expected. Clara sat at Nathan's desk with a lamp pulled close and the top drawer emptied onto the surface in front of her, and she read with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered. Not skimming, reading. The kind of reading where you let each sentence settle before you move to the next one, because documents like these carry meaning in their specifics, and their specifics are exactly what people like Harlan Voss count on you missing. The original land grant was dated 1861. Nathan's father's name, not Nathan's Joseph Cole, granted 1,200 acres in the Wyoming Territory under the homestead provisions, with water rights to the tributary that ran along the northern boundary explicitly included in the language of the grant itself. Not implied, not assumed, written in the careful formal hand of a land office clerk who had been trained to leave nothing ambiguous, because ambiguity in land documents was a kind of currency that the wrong people could spend. She found the first problem on the third page, a transfer document dated 1869, when Nathan's father had conveyed the property to Nathan following his retirement from active ranch management. The transfer was standard in every respect except one. The water rights language from the original grant was not carried forward. Not explicitly. The document referenced the original grant by number, which technically incorporated it by reference, but any lawyer worth the trouble could argue that the absence of explicit language represented a gap. She set that page aside. She kept reading. By midnight, she had found 3 more gaps, places where the legal language had been carefully, almost surgically, imprecise. 2 of them were in documents predating Nathan's ownership. One was in a water rights agreement from 1872 that Nathan had signed with a neighboring property owner who had since sold his land too. She looked at the name. She looked at it again, Harlan Voss. She sat back in the chair. She thought about the timeline. Voss had purchased that neighboring property in 1873. Had arrived in the valley, presenting himself as simply another rancher, expanding westward like everyone else. Had spent a year establishing himself, making himself known, building the surface appearance of a man who belonged here. And then, beginning sometime in early 1874, the small problems had started. The supply price increases, the water rights disputes that came from nowhere. He had been preparing for 2 years. He had known exactly what he was looking for before he bought that land. Which meant someone had told him. She looked at the water rights agreement from 1872. She looked at the name of the man Nathan had signed it with, a rancher named Aldous Pemberton, who had sold to Voss and moved on. She thought about what it takes for a man like Voss to identify a specific property in a specific valley as worth 2 years of careful preparation. You don't do that by accident. You do that because someone, somewhere, put the idea in your head and gave you enough information to make the calculation. She did not know who that someone was. Not yet. But she knew what she needed from Margaret Hale now, and it was more specific than she had thought when she proposed the visit. She needed history, the kind of history that only lived in the memories of people who had been paying attention when no one thought it mattered. She wrote everything down. 3 pages of notes in the back of her recipe book, because it was the only paper she had that she trusted herself not to lose. And because there was something appropriate, she thought, about keeping the evidence in the same place she kept the recipes. Both were about knowing what you had to work with. She was still at the desk when Nathan found her at midnight. He stopped in the doorway. He took in the emptied drawer, the organized stacks of documents, the 3 pages of her handwriting, the lamp burning low. "You've been here all night," he said. "I found something." She turned the water rights agreement toward him and pointed to the specific clause. "This document. The man you signed it with, Pemberton. What do you know about him?" Nathan came to the desk and looked at the page. His face, in the low light, went through several things quickly. He was a rancher, kept to himself mostly. I signed that agreement because we shared water from the tributary, and during seasons it made sense to formalize it. Did you know he was selling to Voss? No, the word was flat. I found out after. Figured it didn't matter because the agreement stayed with the land. He paused. Doesn't it? It should, Clara said. But the language in this section is loose enough that a lawyer could argue the arrangement was between you and Pemberton personally, not you and the land. She tapped the page. If Voss makes that argument, it opens up the northern water access entirely. Nathan was very still. The original grant language is solid, she said. The problem is what happened between 1861 and now. Every time this property changed hands or arrangements changed, someone was slightly imprecise with the language. I don't think it was deliberate. I think it was just the way things were done out here, where people trusted each other and didn't think they needed to be careful. She looked up at him. Voss is counting on that trust working against you. Nathan sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the desk and looked at the documents and breathed. How bad is it? It's fixable, she said. But you need a lawyer who knows land law, and you need him before Voss makes a formal challenge. Because the moment it goes before a judge, the cost of fixing it goes up considerably. She paused. How soon can you get to town? Then tomorrow. She gathered the documents into a stack the organized way, oldest on the bottom. There's someone else you need to see first. Margaret Hale. You still think she'll talk to you? I think she'll talk to me about Eleanor, Clara said. And I think if she talks about Eleanor long enough, she'll tell me things about this property's history that aren't in these documents. Because Eleanor was here from the beginning, and people who are here from the beginning see things that don't get written down. He looked at her across the desk, across the lamp, and the stacked documents and the 3 pages of her recipe book notes. And she could see him doing the thing that men sometimes do when they have been managing everything alone for so long, that being helped has become unfamiliar enough to feel like loss. That specific disorientation of someone who has been carrying weight and has just had a portion of it lifted and isn't sure yet whether the relief is real or whether something is being taken away. Clara, he said. Not Miss Whitfield, the first time. She waited. I brought you out here because I needed someone to feed my men, he said. And I let what happened in the yard happen because I was caught between what I expected and what walked off that coach, and I handled it badly. I've known that since the first night. I should have said it before now. She looked at the lamp. I'm saying it now, he said. I know you are. She paused. I'll be ready before 7. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded, picked up his hat and went. Margaret Hale lived at the east end of the valley, in a house that had been built before most of the current residents arrived. Which was the first thing Clara noted when Walt drove the wagon into her yard the next morning, the settled quality of the place, the way a property looks when it has been cared for long enough to show it. Plants trained over the porch rail, a garden with serious intent behind it. Tools put away correctly. The house of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she was staying and had been making that decision real, board by board every day since. Margaret Hale opened the door before they knocked. She was perhaps 70 small in height but not in presence, with white hair pinned severely, and eyes that had the specific sharpness of someone who had learned to read people because reading people had been necessary for survival. She looked at Clara first, then at Walt, whom she apparently recognized. Walter Greer, she said. I haven't seen you since Eleanor's funeral. No, ma'am, Walt said. Whose idea was it to send a woman to do this, she said. Not unkindly. The analytical kind of directness, mine, Clara said. Margaret Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, then. The conversation started with tea and careful small talk, Margaret's deliberate way of assessing a person before committing to honesty with them. Clara let it happen. She answered questions about where she came from and how she had come to be at the coal ranch with the level of detail she judged appropriate, which was enough to be real and not enough to be performance. She talked about the railroad camps. She talked about the mining towns. She mentioned once that she had spent her whole working life feeding men who had already decided she wasn't quite right for that job. Margaret Hale's eyes shifted at that. Eleanor used to say Margaret began and then stopped. poured more tea, started again. Eleanor used to say that Nathan Cole was a good man who had never learned how to let anyone help him. She said it made him lonely in a way he didn't understand himself. She looked at Clara. Is he still that way? Clara considered the question with the care it deserved. Less, she said. He's working on it. Something in Margaret's expression softened, not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman, but the specific degree of softening that means a person has been given information they needed. What is it you actually want to know? Margaret said. Aldous Pemberton, Clara said. The name landed in the room and did something to Margaret's face that the careful composure couldn't entirely contain. A tightening, a pulling back of some kind. What about him, Margaret? He sold his land to Harlan Voss and moved on. But before he left, was there anything unusual about his departure? Anything that didn't sit right with people who knew him? Margaret set down her teacup. She looked out the window for a moment, and Clara waited. Pemberton was in debt, Margaret said finally. Not dramatically, not the kind of debt people talked about. But I knew Eleanor, and Eleanor knew everything that happened in this valley, and she told me 2 months before she died that Pemberton had borrowed money. A private loan, not through any bank. She paused. The man who lent it to him was Harlan Voss. The kitchen was very quiet. The loan had conditions, Margaret continued. I don't know the specifics. Eleanor wasn't certain of the specifics, but one of them she was sure of was that when Pemberton sold, Voss had the right of first purchase. Clara thought about the water rights agreement. She thought about the loose language. She thought about a man who goes into debt to someone who is already planning to use that debt to position himself next door. How long before Eleanor died did Pemberton take the loan? She said. Margaret looked at her. You're very quick. How long? 18 months, approximately. Maybe long. Clara did the arithmetic. Voss had been planning this since before Eleanor died. Since before Nathan was alone and vulnerable. He had been positioning himself while Eleanor was still alive, still managing the ranch, still the person who noticed things and remembered them and held the community together in the way Margaret had described. He had waited for her to be gone. He had known that without Eleanor, Nathan would be less than he was. Less present, less attentive, less connected to the people around him. And Voss had waited for that, the way a man waits for the support beam to weaken before he tests the wall. There's more, Margaret said. Clara looked up. The water rights agreement that Nathan signed with Pemberton, the one with the imprecise language. She looked at Clara steadily. Eleanor didn't sign that agreement. Clara was very still. What do you mean? She was alive when Nathan signed it. She handled all the legal correspondence for the ranch. Nathan always said he had no head for paperwork, and Eleanor had more than enough for both of them. Every agreement that ranch has ever executed, she read before Nathan signed it. Margaret paused. She did not read that one. Nathan signed it on a day she was ill. He told me about it himself at the funeral. He said it had been weighing on him. He'd done it in a hurry because Pemberton was pressing, and he didn't want to bother Eleanor when she was unwell. She folded her hands in her lap. That agreement was presented to Nathan on a specific day. That specific day. The implication unfolded in Clara's mind slowly and then all at once. Someone told Voss when Eleanor was too ill to review documents, she said. That is what I believe, Margaret said. I cannot prove it. But I know Eleanor, and I know she would never have let that language stand. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then who else in this valley has Voss approached? Who else has he lent money to, or pressured, or positioned himself next to? Margaret looked at her with something that might have been admiration, the reluctant kind that emerges when a person finds someone operating at their own level. She started talking. She talked for an hour and a half. By the time Clara and Walt drove back to the ranch, the recipe book had 6 more pages of notes in it. The lawyer's name was Thomas Birch, and he operated out of a 2-room office above the hardware store in town, which Nathan had apparently been putting off visiting for 2 years because he was the kind of man who dealt with immediate problems and postponed systemic ones. Clara had added his name to her list after Margaret mentioned him. He was According to Margaret, the only lawyer in 3 counties who had successfully argued a water rights case against a larger landowner and won, which made him either very good or very stubborn, and she was willing to work with either. Nathan rode to town that same afternoon. He came back before supper. He came into the kitchen without his hat, which was unusual. Nathan was a man who wore his hat like a second skin and only removed it indoors at the table, and the absence of it had a raw quality, like something had been stripped away. Clara looked at him from the stove. "Birch says the case is winnable," Nathan said. "He also says it won't be quick or cheap, and that Voss has almost certainly already filed a preliminary challenge with the land office." He sat down at the table. "We're already behind." "No," Clara said, and turned back to the stove. "We've been behind. Now we know it. That's different." Walt came in 10 minutes later with Colton behind him, and Nathan laid out what Birch had said, and Colton listened with the particular focus of a young man who has a personal stake in the outcome and is no longer pretending otherwise. When Nathan finished, Colton said, "What does he need?" "Witness testimony. Anyone who can attest to the history of the water rights, the property boundaries, the original use patterns. Birch says the original grant language is on our side, but Voss will argue the subsequent documents supersede it, and we need people who can testify to what the actual practice has been on this land for 15 years. "Margaret Hale," Walt said. "She'll testify," Clara said. "She told me as much before we left," she said. She paused, turning from the stove to look at Nathan. "She said Eleanor would have wanted someone to do something about this, while there was still time to do something." Nathan's jaw worked. He looked at the table. "There's something else," Clara said. She had been deciding all afternoon how to tell him part, and she had not found a way to make it gentle, so she had settled for direct. "Voss knew Eleanor was ill when he had that water rights agreement presented to you. He timed it specifically to happen when she couldn't review it." She paused. "Someone told him when she was too unwell to read documents." The kitchen went very still. Colton looked at Nathan. Walt looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Clara. She met his eyes and held them, because this was the part that would cost him something beyond money or legal effort, and he needed to know she understood that. "Who?" he said. The word was quiet in a way that was the opposite of small. "I don't know yet," she said. "But it's someone who knew your household well enough to know Eleanor's condition on a specific day. Someone Voss trusted enough to be useful to him. She let that land. Birch should know this too." Nathan stood up. He stood at the kitchen counter, with his back to the room for a full minute, and nobody spoke. Then he turned around. His face had gone through something in that minute. Grief, she thought. Not new grief, but old grief newly informed. The particular pain of learning that something you had already survived was worse than you knew it was. "I'll ride back to town in the morning," he said. "I'll tell Birch everything." "Take my notes," Clara said. She tore the 6 pages from the back of the recipe book and set them on the table. "And the documents, the marked ones, the ones I set aside last night. Birch needs the originals." Nathan looked at the pages. "You stayed up until midnight reading property documents," he said. "Someone had to." He looked at her. He looked at the pages. He looked back at her. "Why?" he said. And what he meant by it was not a simple question. It had the weight of everything that had happened in the 4 weeks, since she passed off a stagecoach into a yard full of men laughing at her, all of it compressed into one word. She thought about how to answer. "Because this is my kitchen," she said finally. "And this is my ranch, and nobody gets to take what's mine without going through me first." The silence after that had a different quality from every silence that had come before it in this kitchen. It was not the silence of discomfort or assessment, or people being careful with each other. It was the silence of something that had been waiting to be said, finally being said, and settling into the room the way true things settle, without drama, without resistance, with the quiet authority of something that was always going to be true. Colton made a sound, half laugh, half something else. He covered it by picking up his coffee cup. Walt looked at the ceiling. Nathan looked at Clara with an expression that she recognized now, the architecture of the smile she had first seen on the wagon seat to town, fully present this time, not hidden. "Well then," he said. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, the ranch became something it had never quite been before, a single organism, working toward a common problem. The men who had spent years operating in their separate competencies, doing their work and going to the bunkhouse and eating and doing it again, suddenly had a shared stake in something beyond the daily operation. They knew Voss had tried to break the drive. They knew Voss had sent men to sit on the North Ridge and watch. They knew word traveled in a bunkhouse as fast as fire that someone had betrayed Eleanor's illness to an enemy of this ranch. The anger that produced was not hot and disorganized. It was the cold, purposeful kind. The kind that made men show up early and stay late and do extra work, not because they had to, but because the work meant something. Danny Marsh, who had never shown particular aptitude for anything beyond eating too fast and trying too hard to be useful, turned out to have a remarkable memory for physical boundaries. He had ridden every inch of the coal property in his 1.5 years on the ranch, and could describe fence lines and water access points with the accuracy of a surveyor. Birch interviewed him and came away shaking his head with something that looked like admiration. Roscoe, who had never said more than 3 words together in Clara's presence, presented himself at the kitchen door one morning and told her, in his quiet, unadorned way, that he had been working ranches in this valley for 20 years and had witnessed the installation of the primary water diversion gate that served the coal property. He had been 17. He could describe every person present. And the gate had been put in by Joseph Cole, Nathan's father, 2 years before the Pemberton land even had a claim filed on it. Which meant the water use predated any arrangement with Pemberton and could not be superseded by it. Clara wrote it all down. She gave it to Nathan. Nathan gave it to Birch. The betrayer revealed himself by trying to disappear. A ranch hand named Grover Finch had been with the coal operation for 3 years, quiet, competent, the kind of man who was good enough at his job to be kept on without being distinctive enough to be particularly noticed. On the 8th day before the hearing, he asked Nathan for 2 weeks' advance on his wages and announced he was taking personal leave to visit family in Kansas. Colton, who had known him for those 3 years and knew that Grover Finch had no family in Kansas, came to Clara with it first. She was at the kitchen table with her notes when he came in and told her, and she watched his face while he talked and saw there the specific combination of anger and hurt that comes from discovering that someone you worked beside every day had been watching you all along for someone else's benefit. "How sure are you?" she said. He knew Eleanor's condition, Colton said. He was one of 3 men who helped carry her from the house to the wagon on her last bad day. He was there. He stopped. His hands on the table were flat and still. "And Voss's first rider, the one who came through here before we even knew Voss owned the Pemberton land, Grover is the one who talked to him. I saw it. I didn't think anything of it at the time." He looked at Clara. "I should have thought something of it. You couldn't have known," she said. "I should have paid more attention." "Colton." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, direct, without softness but without hardness either. "You paid attention when it counted. You're here now." He looked at her. "Tell Nathan," she said, "tonight. Before Finch leaves." Grover Finch did not make it to town. Nathan intercepted him at the gate, calm, in the particular way of a man who is controlling a great deal and letting none of it show, and told him that he was going to leave the ranch, but that he would be speaking to Sheriff Alderman in the morning, and that the sheriff would likely want to speak with him before he made any travel arrangements. Finch went pale and said very little, and went back to the bunkhouse. And the next morning Sheriff Alderman came out and had a conversation with him that lasted 2 hours and produced a written statement that implicated Voss in a scheme that had been operating, in one form or another, for nearly 3 years. Birch, when Nathan brought him the statement, said, "I'll be honest with you, Cole. This just changed everything." The morning of the hearing arrived with the particular weight of mornings that have been prepared for so thoroughly that there is nothing left to do but let them happen. Clara had been awake since 4. She had not been able to sleep past 3, actually, but she had lain in the narrow bed off the kitchen, doing the inventory of what was known and what was in place and what could not be controlled, and had found, to her own surprise, that the column of things she could not control was shorter than it had ever been in any major undertaking of her life. She made breakfast the way she always made breakfast: full, proper, the kind that sustains people through hard hours. Eggs, salt pork, cornmeal with extra sugar in it, because Colton was riding into town with Nathan, and he always needed something sweet when he was worried and was not going to admit he was worried. Bread fresh from the morning bake. Coffee so strong that Walt raised his eyebrows at his cup, which was as close as Walt got to a compliment on the coffee. 30 men sat down to breakfast. The room was unusually quiet. Not the bad kind of quiet, the held breath kind, the collective stillness of people who know something is happening titsy and want it to go right. Nathan came to the kitchen before he left, stood in the doorway in his good jacket, not the work clothes she had become accustomed to, but the formal version. The man who showed up for things that required showing up properly, and he held his hat in his hands in the way she had come to understand, meant that he was about to say something he had been working up to. "You know," he said, "I've been sitting with something I don't quite have the right words for." She waited. "When you walked off that coach," he said, "I saw what every other man in that yard saw. And I have been ashamed of that every day since, and I will be ashamed of it for considerably longer." He paused. "But I think I knew, even then, that I was wrong. I think I knew it before Colton opened his mouth. I just didn't say it." "No, you didn't. I'm saying it now. For all the good that does. It does good," she said. "More than you think." He nodded. He put his hat on. "Will you be here when I get back?" She looked at him. She looked at the kitchen, her kitchen, the one she had cleaned and organized and poured herself into for 4 weeks, the stove she had nursed back to life, the pantry she had built into something a cook could actually rely on, the table at which 30 men had argued and laughed and eaten seconds and, one quiet afternoon, told the truth about their broken things. "Where else would I be?" she said. He walked out. Colton was behind him. He stopped at the kitchen door briefly, not making a production of it, and looked at Clara, and said, "He's going to win." "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because he has something worth fighting for," she said. "And he knows it now." Colton looked at her for one moment longer than he needed to. Then he tipped his hat, the full version, not the abbreviated acknowledgement she had seen him give women he was managing, but the real one, the one with intention behind it, and he followed Nathan out to the yard. Walt was at the kitchen table with his 3rd cup of coffee. Clara sat down across from him. "Think they'll win?" Walt said. "Yes. Think Voss will come back at them some other way?" "Probably," she said, "but not today." Walt wrapped both hands around his cup. "What happens then?" "When it's over, I mean. When the hearing's done and Voss has been dealt with." He looked at her steadily with those careful weathered eyes. "You came here on a marriage agreement." She looked at her hands. "Nathan hasn't been a man who deserved a good woman for a while," Walt said. "He's been working his way back to being one." He paused. "I think he might have gotten there." Clara looked at the table. She thought about letters with soft creased edges. She thought about 940 miles, and a yard full of laughter, and a kitchen that had been cold for years. She thought about 2 plates finished in silence, and the architecture of a smile and a man standing in a doorway saying, "I didn't stop it," and meaning it. She thought about her own kitchen, her recipe book. 6 pages of notes that had changed the trajectory of something. She thought about belonging, what it was, what it actually required, how long she had been looking for the version of it that didn't ask her to be smaller than she was. "One thing at a time," she said. Walt nodded. They sat together at the table in the warm kitchen, while the ranch went about its morning around them. And outside, a wagon with 2 men on the seat moved down the road toward town, toward a hearing, toward whatever came next. Clara picked up her coffee cup. She opened her recipe book to a fresh page. She started planning supper. They came back before sundown. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular sound of horses moving at a pace that was neither urgent nor defeated, the steady rhythm of people returning from something that had gone the way it was supposed to go. She was at the stove finishing the supper she had spent all day preparing, and she did not go to the window, and she did not go to the door, because she had decided that morning that she would let Nathan come to her when he was ready, and that whatever his face told her when he walked through that door would tell her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. Walt heard it too. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her. She kept stirring. The yard filled with noise, the wagon, then voices, then the bunkhouse door opening as the men who had been working and waiting all day came out to meet them. She heard the specific pitch of men asking questions and getting answers, and then she heard something she had not expected. She heard cheering, not polite cheering. The real kind, loud and unself-conscious and slightly ragged at the edges, the way genuine emotion always is. The kind of sound that comes from people who have been holding their breath all day and have just been given permission to let it out. She turned the stew to its lowest heat. She smoothed her apron. The kitchen door opened. Nathan came in first, and she read him in the first second, the way she had learned to read him, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the way he was carrying himself, and what she read was not the controlled, careful man who had stood in this kitchen the first night turning his hat by the brim. What she read was someone lighter, someone who had put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time and was still in the process of understanding what it felt like to not have it anymore. He looked at her. "We won," he said. She nodded once. "I know." He blinked. "You could hear from in here?" "I heard the men in the yard," she said. "Sit down." "Supper's almost ready." He sat down. He put his hat on the table, which he never did. He sat there in his good jacket, looking like a man who had arrived somewhere after a very long journey and had not quite accepted yet that he was allowed to stop moving. Colton came in behind him, and Colton's face was a thing Clara would remember for a long time, the full, uncomplicated openness of it, the armor entirely gone, nothing performing anything. Just a 23-year-old young man who had watched justice happen for the first time in his adult life and didn't know quite what to do with his hands. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and said Birch was magnificent. "I mean it. I've never seen anything like it. He had Voss's lawyer turned inside out inside of 20 minutes. Walt said, "Sit down, Colton." Colton sat down. "Tell it from the beginning," Clara said, and went back to the stove. So they told it. Nathan told most of it, with Colton interrupting at intervals to add the parts Nathan summarized too quickly, and Walt asking the occasional precise question that moved the account forward when it threatened to stall on a detail. The hearing had begun with Voss's lawyer presenting the water rights challenge, the imprecise language in the 1872 agreement, the argument that the arrangement had been personal rather than land-bound, the suggestion that without explicit language, Nathan's water access to the northern tributary was not legally guaranteed. Birch had let him finish, entirely, without interruption, without objection, without any visible reaction at all. And then he had stood up and presented, in order, the original 1861 land grant with its explicit water rights language, the documented history of continuous water use on the coal property for 15 years. Roscoe's testimony about the installation of the primary diversion gate, predating any Pemberton claim, Danny Marsh's testimony about the physical boundaries of the property and the consistent patterns of water access, and Margaret Hale's testimony about Eleanor's knowledge of the property's legal history and her certainty that the imprecise language in the 1872 document had been presented under circumstances designed to prevent proper review. And then Colton said, leaning forward, both hands on the table, Birch put Grover Finch's written statement in front of the judge. The kitchen was very quiet. Voss's lawyer asked for a recess, Nathan said. He got 15 minutes. When he came back, he withdrew the water rights challenge entirely. Walt said, "And the cattle drive interference?" Sheriff Alderman had filed a separate complaint, Nathan said. "That's still pending. But Birch says the statement is enough to make it stick." He paused. Voss isn't done. He'll sell, Colton said. That's what he does when a place gets too complicated. He'll sell and move somewhere easier. He said it without satisfaction, which surprised Clara. She had expected the younger man to want more than that, to want something louder and more complete. But what was in his voice was not satisfaction or dissatisfaction. It was just tiredness. The tired of someone who has been carrying something since they were 16 years old and has watched part of it resolve, and is honest enough to know that resolution is not the same as healing. Clara put a bowl of stew in front of him without being asked. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the stew. Or not only for the stew, eat," she said. She fed them, all three of them, at the table, and then the men who came to the kitchen door in ones and twos as the evening progressed, wanting to know, wanting to celebrate in the particular way of men who express relief and joy through proximity to warmth and food rather than through the words they don't have for it. She made more bread. She made the molasses cake that she had been saving for a specific occasion and had decided this morning was that occasion, 3 layers of it in the big pan, the kind that takes 2 hours and is worth every minute. Danny Marsh nearly knocked over a lamp when he saw the cake. She let him have the first slice. The kitchen that night was the loudest it had ever been, and she stood at the stove in the middle of it and listened to 30 men who had been, 4 weeks ago, a collection of separate silences, talking and arguing and laughing and refilling each other's coffee cups. And she thought about what a kitchen actually is at its best: not a room, not an appliance, not a function. A gathering place. The kind of place where people become slightly more themselves than they manage to be anywhere else, because something about warmth and food and the smell of good things cooking lowers the guards that the rest of the world requires. She had built this, not alone, not without the men who had started showing up early, and the boy who filled the woodbox, and the old man who drank his coffee with sugar now without making anyone ask. Not without Nathan, who had come back from town with a straight spine and said, "We won," like it was something they had done together, because it was. But she had started it. She had walked into this cold, abandoned kitchen with 2 bags and a recipe book and a cast-iron conviction that a person's value is demonstrated not by what others think of them at the beginning, but by what they build by the end, and she had started it, and it had become this. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the last of the men drifted back to the bunkhouse, full and tired in the good way. Walt stayed to help her wash up, which he always did now without being asked, and Colton stayed too, drying the pots with the efficiency of someone who had finally decided that helping in this kitchen was not a concession of any kind, but simply what you did when you lived in a place you actually cared about. Nathan stayed. He sat at the head of the table while the other 2 worked, and he was quiet. But it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after rather than before, the settled kind, the kind that has made its peace with itself. When the kitchen was clean and Walt and Colton had said their goodnights and gone, Nathan was still there. Clara wiped down the stove, her stove, clean as the day she had first gotten it that way, which had taken her the better part of an afternoon, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him. The particular atmospheric weight of this specific man in this specific room. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was standing now. He had picked up his hat from the table and was holding it in both hands, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not the architecture of a smile. Not the controlled, careful surface, not the caught halfway look of the first day. Just him, the actual man underneath all of it. The one who ate 2 plates in silence the first night and rode to town to have a hard conversation with a lawyer and stood in a hearing room and watched a judge rule in his favor and came home and said, "We won," like it belonged to both of them. "I owe you more than I know how to say," he said. She looked at him. "That's not what I actually wanted to say," he said. "That's the thing I'm leading with, because I don't know how to get to the thing I actually want to say." "Then say it," she said. He turned the hat by the brim once, set it on the table, looked at her without the intermediary of the hat in his hands, which she recognized as something it cost him. "I came into this arrangement thinking I needed a practical solution to a practical problem," he said. someone to run the household, someone to feed the men. I told myself that was a reasonable basis for a marriage agreement, and that reasonable was enough. He paused. I want to tell you that I know it wasn't enough. And I want to tell you that somewhere between the first night and this one, reasonable stopped being the word I would use for what I feel about you being here. Kitchen was very still. Clara looked at Nathan Cole, this weathered, careful, complicated man who had needed 4 weeks and a legal hearing and the slow accumulation of 30 suppers to find his way to the words he had always been working toward, and she felt the thing she had been feeling for some time, and had been quietly, precisely honest with herself about and had declined to act on because she was not a woman who moved toward things before she was sure of them. She was sure of him now, not in the way she had once been sure of letters with soft creased edges. Sure in the harder way, the real way, the way you're sure of something you have watched behave under pressure, and found it did not break. Nathan, she said. He waited. I came 940 miles on the basis of a marriage agreement, she said. And I want to tell you that I had already decided, before I stepped off that coach, that if the man who wrote those letters turned out to be less than what he wrote, I was going to the next town and finding a different situation. She paused. You were less than what you wrote, for about 3 hours. And then you came into this kitchen and apologized for your part in it and sent Walt to help me. And every day since that you have been more than what you wrote. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand that I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I turned down Voss's offer. I could have taken it. I stayed because this is where I chose to be. Another pause. I want you to know the difference between someone who stays because they must and someone who stays because they want to. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. I know the difference, he said quietly. Good. Is that he stopped. Started over. Are you telling me that you want to stay in the permanent sense? I'm telling you I want to be asked, she said, in the proper sense. He looked at her. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He didn't reach for his hat, or look at the wall, or do any of the things he did when he needed something to occupy his hands while he worked up to a difficult thing. He just looked at her, steadily and directly, the way she had learned meant he had arrived at something he was sure of. Miss Clara Whitfield, he said, I would like you to marry me. Not because this ranch needs managing, and not because my men need feeding, though you have done both better than I had any right to expect. Because I have watched you walk into a yard full of men laughing at you and refuse to flinch. I have watched you read legal documents by lamplight until midnight and spend the next morning tracking down a witness who didn't like me. I have watched you feed people the way some people pray with everything you have, no portion kept back. And I have watched this kitchen go from the coldest place on property to the warmest, and I know who did that. He paused. I would like to spend the rest of my life watching what you do next. The kitchen was completely quiet. Clara looked at Nathan Cole and felt something she had no interest in managing or measuring or keeping at a careful distance. She had been careful for 29 years. She had been practical and self-sufficient, and she had taken care of herself when no one else would, and she had found, in the doing of it, that capability is its own kind of pride, but that pride is a cold companion when the lamp is out. Yes, she said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He took both her hands in his, the way a man holds something he intends to keep. And he looked at her with that expression she had been watching slowly become possible on his face since the first night, fully present now. Every part of it, nothing withheld. I should warn you, she said, that I intend to reorganize the study next. He laughed fully. The first time she had heard it completely unguarded, without the shape of a laugh impersonating itself the real version, low and warm, the laugh of a man who has remembered that laughing is something he is allowed to do. Reorganize whatever you want, he said. She looked at their hands. She thought about her mother's knives, wrapped in their cloth roll, and her grandmother's recipes sewn into the book she carried 940 miles, and the cast-iron conviction she had packed alongside them that a person does not become valuable in the moment someone recognizes their value. A person is valuable, The recognition is just the world catching up to what was always true. She had known her own worth in railroad camps and mining towns, and a boarding house in Cheyenne, and a yard full of men laughing. She had known it when Voss named his number, and she turned it down, and when she stayed up until midnight, with property documents that were not her legal problem, but had become her practical one. She had known it every morning she woke before the ranch and got the stove burning, and started building the day from the ground up, the way she had always built everything from nothing, from scratch. From the conviction that what she made with her hands, and her attention, and her whole unguarded heart was worth making. She had known. She had been waiting for this place to know it too. It knew now. 3 days later, Margaret Hale came to the ranch. She arrived unannounced in the early afternoon, driving her own wagon with the economy of a woman who has been doing things herself for 50 years and does not consider this remarkable. And she tied the horse herself and knocked on the kitchen door rather than the main house door, which told Clara everything she needed to know about Margaret Hale's instincts. Clara opened the door. Margaret looked at her. She looked at the kitchen behind her, the clean stove, the organized shelves visible through the pantry door, the recipe book open on the counter. She looked at Clara's hands. "Are you going to stay?" Margaret said. "Yes," Clara said. Margaret nodded once. "Good." She held out a box, wooden small, the kind used for keepsake. "I want you to have this." Eleanor would have wanted someone to have it who would understand what it was. Clara took the box. She opened it. Inside was a collection of seed small paper envelopes, each one labeled in a precise, careful hand. The kitchen garden. The one Eleanor had planted and maintained every summer until she couldn't. Every variety, catalogued and saved, with the care of someone who fully intended to come back to them. Clara looked at the seeds. She looked at Margaret. Her throat did something she did not try to prevent. "She saved them every fall," Margaret said quietly. "She told me once that a garden you've planned for is a kind of faith. That you put the seeds away knowing you might not be the one who plants them, but someone will." She paused. She knew this place needed someone who would plant them. Clara closed the box. She held it with both hands. "Thank you," she said. The words were not enough, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Margaret came in for coffee and stayed 2 hours and told Clara more about Eleanor, not the sad parts, not the dying, but the living parts. The way she had laughed and argued and kept impeccable records, and driven Nathan half mad with her insistence on doing things properly, and kept the whole enterprise of this ranch alive through 3 bad winters and 2 bad seasons by sheer force of organized determination. Clara listened. She understood, by the end of it, that Eleanor Cole had been a woman of exceptional capability who had been in a place that needed her, and that she had poured herself into it completely. And that the shape of what she had built was still present in this ranch, in ways that Nathan couldn't quite see because he was inside it. She understood that she was not replacing Eleanor. She was continuing something. That was different. And it was enough. A week after the hearing, Birch sent word that Voss had listed the neighboring property for sale. Nathan read the letter at the kitchen table while Clara was finishing the morning bread, and he read it twice, and then he set it down and said nothing for a moment. "Is it over?" Danny Marsh asked from his corner of the table, because Danny Marsh had no instinct for the appropriate time to ask questions, but compensated for this with an accuracy of aim that was occasionally startling. "For now," Nathan said. "For good," Colton said from across the table. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who has decided to believe something true into being. He said it the way people say things when they have been carrying a wound for 7 years and have finally, watched the source of it retreat. He looked at Clara when he said it. She looked back. She had watched Colton Hayes change over the 5 weeks since she arrived with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, the incremental loosening of the armor. The slow emergence of the young man underneath who had been trying to protect himself from further loss since he was 16 years old and had never quite learned how to stop. He was still prickly on the edges. He was still likely to say something sharp when he meant to say something honest. But he had started sitting closer to the center of the table rather than the end. He had started arriving for meals a few minutes early rather than late. He had started, Clara noticed, saying thank you to the men who passed him things, rather than just taking them. Small things, the kind that add up. She had made him a batch of molasses cookies on Thursday. She had left them on the table with no comment and gone back to the stove and let him think about it. He had eaten 4 before supper and left the rest for Danny, which was its own kind of growth. The morning she and Nathan rode to town to make it official to speak with the circuit minister, who came through every other month, to make the arrangement real in the way the arrangement had never quite been real before Clara got up earlier than usual. She made the bread. She got the stew going for that evening because it needed to cook long, and she would not be there to start it later. She set out the coffee and the sugar and made sure Walt knew where everything was that he might need, because the kitchen was hers, but it was also, increasingly, everyone's. Walt came in at 5:30 and found her finishing up. He stood in the doorway. "You could have left this for someone else today," he said. "I could have," she agreed. She untied her apron, folded it, set it on the counter. Picked up her good shawl. "But it's still my kitchen." Walt looked at her for a long moment with those careful, weathered eyes. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. Clara smoothed the shawl across her shoulders. "I know," she said. "I would have liked her too." Walt nodded. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat down at the table. And she heard. As she walked through the kitchen door toward the yard, where Nathan was waiting with the wagon, and the morning light was just beginning to come over the eastern ridge in that particular Wyoming gold that came too fast and left too soon, she heard Walt say to the empty kitchen quietly, to no one, or perhaps to someone about time. She smiled all the way to town. The minister was a small, efficient man named Reverend Polk, who had been burying people across the Wyoming territory for 20 years and had developed a gift for reading a room. He looked at the two of them standing in the front of the church, Nathan in his good jacket again, Clara in her best dress, the blue one she had packed at the very bottom of the first bag, because she had told herself she was being practical but had known, even then, that she was being hopeful, and he performed the ceremony with a particular warmth of someone who has seen enough of life to recognize when two people are making a real decision rather than a convenient one. When it was done, Nathan looked at her. She looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She laughed first. Then he laughed. The full version, the real one. And she thought about the first night she had heard it, and how she had known even then that the man capable of that laugh was worth more than the man she had watched stand in his yard and say nothing. They drove back in the afternoon light. The yard was full when they arrived. 30 men had apparently decided that the occasion required a gathering, though no one had organized it, and no one admitted to organized it, which meant Walt had organized it, and told everyone it was their own idea. The table had been moved outside. It was summer, and the evenings were long, and someone had built a fire in the yard. There was food on the table. Clara looked at the food with the eye of a professional, and then looked at Danny Marsh, who was standing next to the table, with an expression of extreme pride barely contained. "You cooked," she said. "We all cooked," Danny said. "Walt told us what to do. I did the bread." He looked slightly uncertain. "It's not as good as yours." She walked over and looked at the bread. "It's good, Danny," she said. He stood 3 inches taller. She looked around the yard at 30 men who had laughed at her arrival and had become, over 5 weeks, something she had not expected to find at the end of 940 miles. Not just co-workers, not just the people she fed, something harder to name and more worth having. The people who had watched her work and chosen to show up alongside her. The people who had seen her stand in the face of Colton's cruelty and Voss's manipulation and a kitchen that had been cold for years, and who had watched her refuse, steadily and completely, to become smaller than she was. Colton was standing at the edge of the group. He had his hat in his hands. He caught her eye across the yard, and he held her gaze, and he did something she had never seen him do in the direction of anyone. He nodded. Not the abbreviated managed nod, not the gesture of a man conceding a point. The full version. The one that means I see you and I know what this took, and I will not forget it." She nodded back. Nathan was beside her. He had not left her side since they climbed down from the wagon, which she noticed and valued and said nothing about because the noticing was enough. The evening settled in the way Wyoming summer evenings settle, long and golden, and then abruptly purple and cool, the stars arriving fast once they start. The men ate and talked, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and there was music, actual music, the first she had heard on this ranch. And Danny Marsh danced by himself without self-consciousness until 3 of the older men took pity on him and taught him something less likely to cause injury. Clara sat at the head of the outside table with Nathan beside her. She watched her ranch in the summer evening. She thought about seeds in small paper envelopes, saved by someone who knew she might not be there to plant them, but had faith that someone would be. She thought about what it means to build something in a place that didn't want you at first. That the building is harder and the thing built is stronger. The way wood that grows in difficult conditions grows denser than wood that grows easy. She thought about 29 years of knowing her own worth in rooms where nobody else did. She had not needed this place to validate her. She had needed a place worth building. That was what she had found, not a rescue, not a reward for endurance. Not a man who finally saw her after 30 others had looked away. A place where her full self, her size, her competence, her stubbornness, her capability, her molasses in the cornmeal, and her midnight document reading, and her absolute refusal to disappear was not just tolerated but needed. Genuinely, structurally, irrevocably needed. She had built that. And it was hers. Nathan took her hand in the cooling evening. She let him. They sat together at the head of the table while the fire burned and the fiddle played, and 30 men who had once laughed filled the night with something that sounded unmistakably like home. The woman who had stepped off a stagecoach into a yard full of mockery with 2 bags and a handmade recipe book and a cast-iron will had not come 940 miles to be accepted. She had come to build something worth accepting, and she had.